Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I know there hasn't been much content on the channel lately, but I just got back from Egypt and I'm ready to dive back in. I also brought back with me a cold, so I'm going to try to push through as best I can. We're not looking at a very long video today as I ease my way back into making regular content for the channel, but I saw that History Matters, with their nearly 2 million subscribers, has a video that came out about a week and a half ago that has 500,000 views already. It's called "Why Didn't the Border States Join the Confederacy?" It's a Civil War topic, but it's one we haven't really covered on this channel because the fact is that not all of the states where slavery was legal in 1861 actually seceded and joined the Confederacy. Specifically, we're talking about Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So why didn't they join? That's the topic for today. I'll put the link in the description. As always, you can check it out without my commentary. If you haven't already heard and you didn't see my announcement, we have a new group trip available. I've added a second Scotland tour with a slightly different itinerary. It's going to be in August of 2026, and as of this moment we have 13 available spots for that. If you want to check it out, the link is in the description. You can read all about it. You can see the full itinerary, and if you choose to, you can make a deposit to secure your spot. A lot of our tours have been going fast. I do have a couple of available spots left on our Jordan tour for February of 2026 and our Hadrian's Wall walking tour in April of 2026. And both of those tours will close for new bookings in about a week and a half. So we want to try and get those last spots secured. We've got 4 spots left in Jordan and 5 spots left for Hadrian's Wall. So check those out if you want. All the links are in the description. Let's dive into this one.
When the Confederacy was formed in early 1861, its leaders had high hopes that in the end it would contain these 15 states.
So cool that they start out.
In early
Let's pause right there.
1861, its leaders had high hopes.
When the Confederacy first kind of comes into reality, Jefferson Davis becomes its provisional president pending a permanent appointment as president. It initially contains only what you would call the Deep South. Actually, even North Carolina wasn't initially a part of that. We're talking about kind of across the bottom here: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. South Carolina was first. But as you get into the events of the spring with the firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and then you have Lincoln calling up 75,000 volunteers for 3 months of service, that's where you get Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina to join the Confederacy.
Hopes that in the end it would contain these 15 states. However, by the end of the year, it had become clear that these 4 slave states along the border probably weren't going to join and were sticking with the Union. But given that these states maintained slavery, none of them had voted for Lincoln to be president, and that they held deep sympathies with the Confederacy, this raises the question: why did they stick with the United States instead of throwing their lot in with the Confederate states?
I don't know if I'd entirely agree with the idea that they had. I mean, there were certainly significant populations in those states that had sympathy for the Confederacy. Heck, there were significant populations in places like southern Illinois that had no love for African Americans. And in fact, when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, which kind of reframes the war for the Union side as more than just about preserving the Union, but also about the issue of slavery, which had driven the Confederacy to secede in the first place. A lot of the southern Illinois soldiers threatened mutiny because they're like, I'm not fighting for that, I'm fighting to preserve the Union.
So the answer is actually quite complicated. And as you'll have guessed, it's not simply a case of slave states backing secession, because the picture across basically all of the slave states was complicated. Abraham Lincoln, during the 1860 election, ran on an abolitionist ticket. But it's important to note that
he didn't, though. It wasn't an abolitionist ticket. In fact, they were quite vocal about the fact that the platform was not for abolition, though there was strong abolitionist sentiment in the new Republican Party. The official platform and Lincoln's personal stance on the issue was that we are just running to oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories. Of course, the South saw the expansion of slavery as vital for the continued existence of slavery. And so even though Lincoln wasn't running on an abolition platform, even though he may personally have felt that way, the Confederacy equated the end of expansion with the end of slavery, and so to them it was the same thing.
Within this camp, he was seen as a moderate. Lincoln
He was.
openly opposed the expansion of slavery, but made it clear that he believed that the federal government didn't have the right to abolish slavery everywhere,
Right.
and that even if it could, he wouldn't want it to. Now, most slaveholders...
I don't know that he felt that even if it could, he wouldn't want them to. I think if Lincoln felt that the federal government had the power and the authority to abolish slavery, he probably would have done it. It didn't have that authority until the 13th Amendment was passed, which gave it the constitutional authority to do that.
didn't believe him, and so backed the Democratic Party, which had historically supported slavery in the southern economies that relied upon it. The Democrats had nominated Stephen A. Douglas, a famed rival of Lincoln, as their presidential candidate, who had hoped to bridge the gap between North and South, but fun fact, no. You see, the problem with this strategy was that a certain James Buchanan was still the president, and he wasn't a fan of Douglas or his pushing of popular sovereignty. The idea that a state's population should be the one to decide on whether to allow slavery in said state or not. As such, Buchanan and other slave-owning Southern Democrats boycotted the nomination vote.
Buchanan was not a slave-owning Southern Democrat. James Buchanan was from Pennsylvania. Not a great start here, History Matters, when it comes to your facts. Let's see what happens.
They then decided to select their own nominee and went with John C. Breckinridge, who campaigned on guaranteeing the rights of slave owners on a federal level.
So John C. Breckinridge is Buchanan's vice president, who is a Southerner. He's from, kind of, and he's from a border state. He's from Kentucky. Youngest vice president in American history. He's only 36 when he gets elected. To this day, he's the youngest. Second youngest is Richard Nixon. Third youngest, our current vice president, J.D. Vance.
And hinted that slave states maybe wanted to secede if he lost. Now, you'd think that splitting the pro-slavery vote in two would be a bad idea. But they weren't done yet. A fourth candidate, John Bell, was put forward by the Constitutional Union Party, whose policy platform was basically slavery good, secession bad. To the surprise of absolutely nobody, the unified anti-slavery Republican vote won the election, and Abraham Lincoln was on his way to the White House. And across many...
Beard time. Yeah, Lincoln did not have a beard when he got elected president. He grew a beard between his election and when he came to Washington and took office in March of 1861.
States, the election was actually quite close. After the election and Lincoln's triumph, it was time for secession.
And just to clear up one thing, you often hear it said that the southern states kept Lincoln off the ballot. That is not true. The way things worked at that time is, this idea of a ticket is literal. There was an actual, you didn't go in with a form that had everybody listed on it and then you checkmarked who you wanted to win. You actually took in a ticket that had the candidates that you were voting for, and you dropped that in. And so the party would print these tickets, and you would vote. And so the Republican Party, knowing that they had no chance of winning the presidency in any of those southern states, just chose not to make tickets. They just chose not to run. They weren't like kept off the ballot. People in South Carolina weren't banning Abraham Lincoln from being voted for. They just chose not to waste their time.
These states, either by legislative votes or by referenda, all chose to eventually secede from the United States, despite some of them only having been there for 5 minutes. Across the border states, there was
16 years a state. And yeah, at the time, the governor of Texas is Sam Houston, and he was vocally, quite strongly opposed to Texas seceding and joining the Confederacy.
a lot of arguing about whether or not they should stay or go. So why did they choose to stay?
In fact, it's kind of interesting to think about. Some of those border states that ended up not joining the Confederacy had very pro-Confederacy governments, and yet a place like Texas that did join the Confederacy had a very pro-union governor.
The first common thread within the border states was that slavery was nowhere near as vital to their economies as those that made up the Confederacy.
In fact, even within the states that joined the Confederacy, there are huge chunks of those states that are very pro-union. Northern Alabama, especially northeastern Alabama, pro-union. In fact, they end up raising Union regiments in the Civil War. A good chunk of Kentucky, very pro-union. Of course, they didn't join the Confederacy. Eastern Tennessee, very pro-union. That's where you have Andrew Johnson coming from, who's going to be the pro-union, but very much a slave owner and pro-slavery wartime governor of Tennessee.
Whilst most voters in these states were fine with the continuation of slavery, that wasn't enough to secede and risk what would likely come afterwards. So
Right.
as you'll all know, there's a scientifically proven link between your intelligence and the height of your hat. And as such, we can safely say that Lincoln was no idiot. He knew that he couldn't convince the die-hard Democrats to trust that he wouldn't take away their slaves. However, he saw these states as potentially persuadable, and he needed them to be because if they were to leave, the Confederacy would have become a much greater threat.
Yeah, so let's take a look at this. Railroads, the land, the population. It was a big deal, of course, when Virginia and North Carolina joined the Confederacy because these two states, which are among the last to join the Confederacy, end up providing the most troops to the Confederacy of any states. No North Carolina and Virginia, and the Confederacy just has no chance from the beginning. So those two states joining gave them a fighting chance. You had Kentucky, you had Maryland, which surrounds Washington, D.C., to the mix. You had Missouri. Big deal.
As such, he appointed many pro-Union Southerners to his cabinet to help convince these states that he was on their side.
As well as a number of war Democrats, as they were called, to prominent military positions, which in the end was a net negative for the Union. And most of those guys kind of got filtered out of leadership toward the end of the war. That's George McClellan hung on for as long as he did because he was a war Democrat. Guys like John McClernand, a war Democrat. These are guys that were not good generals, but that Lincoln needed in those positions to kind of say to the Democrats, see, this is a coalition. And once you get past the 1862 fall congressional elections, Lincoln's like, you know what, don't need you as much anymore.
That he would protect slavery in the states that currently permitted it. Shockingly, this wasn't enough to prevent secessionist movements within them, and sizable chunks of their populations did favour secession. And as you'll know, political turmoil soon turned into military action and the US Civil War had begun. Almost immediately after the fighting had started, Lincoln asked the remaining states to lend their militias to the war effort. However, these states between both sides refused, and of them, these soon joined the Confederacy. The notable absence in this refusal to take up arms was Delaware, which, despite being a slave state, actually had very few slaves, and its people and politicians were overwhelmingly pro-Union. And also, even if secession had been popular, it would have been stupid anyway. Delaware didn't border any of the Confederate states, and so would have been pacified by Union forces pretty swiftly.
Which is kind of what happens in Maryland. There was a strong... Maryland's kind of divided. Western Maryland is more pro-Union. Eastern Maryland's more pro-Confederacy. Lincoln recognized pretty early on that Maryland was probably going to have to be held by force. And this was just a military necessity. They surrounded Washington, D.C. Any of the troops that were coming to Washington had to pass through Maryland, and you had troops get attacked coming through Baltimore. There was a real threat toward the ability of Congress to even gather and meet to pass important legislation, including legislation related to the war effort, if they couldn't get to D.C. And so that's where you have Lincoln suspending habeas corpus early on, unilaterally without Congress, because he had no choice, because Congress wouldn't have even been able to meet in order to pass a bill supporting the idea of suspending habeas corpus, which is in the Constitution. It allows for that in times of rebellion. But it's really a power that's delegated to the Congress, but Congress couldn't gather to meet because they weren't already in D.C. They had to come. And so once they gathered, they did pass a resolution supporting that.
Anyway, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland all quickly declared their neutrality. Many there wished to remain in the Union but had no intention of taking up arms because they didn't want to fight their fellow Americans. Right. And more selfishly, doing so would place them on the front lines of the war, and nobody wanted that. So Maryland was right next to the capital. And so obviously was a state that both the Union and the Confederacy wanted on side.
Yeah, in fact, one of the main purposes behind Robert E. Lee's 1862 invasion of Maryland, which culminates in the Battle of Antietam, was this notion that he thought that if they brought the Confederate Army into Maryland, that all of these Marylanders who were very pro-Confederacy were going to rise up and support the cause. But the problem was he was in the wrong part of Maryland. That was the pro-Union part of Maryland.
The population there was very divided on what to do, and so, riots. Thomas Holliday Hicks, the pro-Union governor there, soon caved to pro-Confederate voices pushing for a convention on secession. And so Hicks chose to hold it here in a small pro-Union town. And when many secessionist legislators arrived to have their say, they were soon arrested.
Yep.
And it was decided by those who remained that Maryland would remain in the Union for now, but it would also refuse the passage of federal troops through the state. This outcome wouldn't matter much because President Lincoln had declared martial law across Maryland, the legality of which was very dubious, but Lincoln had a war to win. And often, things like legal precedent go out of the window during times like this. Irrespective of what the courts thought, this action guaranteed Maryland would remain in the Union. But what about the other potential breakaways, Kentucky and Missouri? Well, the two of them were also very divided about which side to pick. In Kentucky, state legislators were pro-Union, whereas its governor was undecided.
And in fact, you end up with like a shadow government, a Confederate government. So Kentucky had a Union government and a Confederate government.
Politicians were fully aware of the state's divided loyalties, and didn't want conflict within its borders either. Thus, it opted to remain in the Union, but on the condition that its neutrality be respected. And the reasons that the Unionists made such concessions were that 1. War sucks and not dying was preferable if possible, and 2. The legislators were much older than the average Kentuckian, and the younger generations generally favoured rebelling and joining the Confederacy.
Yeah, and, a lot is made of the notion of who is going to send troops into Kentucky first, and there's an argument about how Leonidas Polk moves troops into western Kentucky, and then Grant immediately responds by bringing his army from Belmont or from Cairo, Illinois, into Kentucky, and that's the end of neutrality for Kentucky. But the fact is, there were already troops in Kentucky. The book I'm writing right now on the 20th Ohio, in October of 1861, the 20th Ohio, which was still being formed at that time, had already moved into northern Kentucky in the outskirts of Cincinnati, where they were guarding the southern defenses of the city of Cincinnati, which was a vital Union city on the Ohio River. So there were already troops there, and there were troops being raised on both sides. I have family who were in Kentucky units for the Confederacy, and I have family who were in Kentucky units for the Union.
As such, those in the state militia were ordered to repel any troops trying to move through the state, and the governor, whilst disliking Lincoln and being pro-slavery, respected the decision of the legislators, and told both sides to leave Kentucky alone. The Confederacy, however, didn't feel like waiting and wanted control over the state's railroads. To do this, they invaded, the Union moved in response, and the governor ordered both to leave. The legislature disagreed and blamed the Confederacy for invading first, and in response opted to join the Union cause fully. The Confederacy soon launched a large-scale invasion and occupied these lands here, within which a pro-Richmond government was formed, but it didn't really have much power. That said, it did have seats in the CSA Congress and was very much claimed by the Confederacy. And in Missouri, the story was similar. Claiborne Jackson, the governor there, was pro-Confederacy and wanted federal troops to leave the state. When they refused, Jackson called up the state militia and asked the Confederacy for help. After hearing about this, but before Jackson could make the first move, Union troops launched an offensive and forced the governor to flee the capital. As such, for most of the war, the Union was in control of most of the state.
Yeah.
And whilst the Confederacy did officially consider Missouri to be a member, those from there who favoured secession had essentially zero control, and the state remained in the Union in basically every way. Although when John C. Fremont, the former Republican leader, was given command of the region, he took it upon himself to proclaim the emancipation of all the state slaves.
Yeah, so Fremont is the 1856 Republican nominee for president, first Republican nominee for president ever. And he basically sets himself up in like a little fiefdom out in Missouri, and just was big headaches for Lincoln, because he would do things like proclaiming emancipation, and then Lincoln would have to step in and say, no, you don't have the authority to do that. It wasn't that Lincoln wouldn't himself proclaim emancipation, but it had to come from the president. It couldn't just be happening like that in individual states, and it would get everybody worked up and going. And Lincoln was, above all things, a pragmatist, and he understood what was politically possible, and he knew that this was not the way to do it.
And ordered the summary execution of rebelling Missourians, which obviously upset the people there, and so Lincoln quickly removed him because he was making the Union look bad. Now, as the war continued, pro-secessionist groups still existed in these border states, but obviously they never left the Union for several reasons. The first and most obvious is that the Union controlled the legislatures of the state, and pro-Confederacy individuals within state governments were either arrested or fled, and thus were stripped of their offices. They were promptly replaced by pro-Union politicians who obviously weren't going to call a convention on whether or not to leave. And so, any attempts to join the Confederacy were immediately seen as illegitimate, and It's not like they could just wait for the next election. Beyond this, though, popular opinion moved against the Confederacy in all these states over time, and the idea of leaving lost its shine pretty quickly. The most evident reason was that it wasn't long until it became clear that the Confederacy was struggling. The Confederates launched numerous offensives into the border states across the Civil War, but all of these failed, meaning that pro-Union politicians still remained in charge. And when the European powers refused to recognize the CSA as an
Slavery is gross, and you're gross for liking it.
Independent nation, most
Was that Queen Victoria on the wall?
still remained in charge. And when the European powers refused to recognize the CSA as an independent nation, most people saw the writing on the wall. Furthermore, even beyond the losing thing, some of the Confederate states' terms of membership were seen as a bit too restrictive. Whilst many states felt that their rights were being infringed by Washington, Richmond was also quick to centralize power during the war.
Yeah, that's the funny thing, is that the very thing that the Confederacy is claiming matters most to them, which is the state's right to govern itself and to make its own decisions, Jefferson Davis, as president of the Confederacy, immediately laments that he doesn't have the same powers that Lincoln does, and he wants to centralize every bit, and he runs into a lot of trouble with state governors, especially like the governor of Georgia, for example, who just were not playing his game.
For example, states within the CSA were forbidden from ever abolishing slavery, irrespective of whether or not their populations changed their mind.
So much for states' rights.
Which for the border states and their ever-declining enslaved population was seen as an inevitable future problem. And to complicate things, there was no clarity on whether or not a state could legally secede from the Confederacy, or if it was simply stuck there forever. Also, Jefferson Davis's government introduced a national draft, which meant that the individual states had no say on whether or not their men would fight, which they had previously been able to do in the Union, although Lincoln would soon do the same. By 1864, it was painfully
pay $300 or go straight to war. Yeah, you could pay a bounty. You could pay a substitute fee, and someone else would go in your place.
That the Confederate states had lost, and so it was mostly a matter of time before they realized it too. And interestingly, when President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't apply to the border states, now including West Virginia, although most of them would soon end the practice on their own terms.
And that was intentional because Lincoln did it as a war measure, and he declared that only the enslaved people in places that were in rebellion could be declared free. Because he didn't feel he had the legal authority to free slaves in states that remained loyal and whose laws were still in force because they weren't rebelling, and therefore it couldn't be used as a war measure to confiscate property. It was all a very slippery slope for Lincoln, and he understood that, but he was doing what he could to try and win the war and figured they'd kind of work out the legal stuff afterwards, which they did with the 13th Amendment.
With Kentucky and Delaware maintaining slavery until the 13th Amendment was passed after the war was over, meaning that whilst their remaining in the Union only spared them some of the fighting, it at least meant that these states weren't rubble after the war was over. And unlike their southern brothers, they held much greater sway on how the nation would progress in the decade afterwards. And oddly, it was during the Reconstruction era that followed that many Kentuckians started to identify more with the South than the North, leading some to quip that Kentucky had only joined the Confederacy after it had lost the war. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
All right, that was good. So it started out a little rough. There were a few things there that I don't think were quite right, but I think by and large it was a pretty good presentation on the events in a very kind of quick way of being able to focus on those things. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Check out our tours, especially Jordan and Hadrian's Wall, because both of those I have to close for new bookings in a week and a half. It's like the 19th is the deadline for that. So check those out and try and sign up. Would love to have you. Thanks for watching.